就是这个啊。
Okay, everybody, good afternoon. How is everybody doing today? So, yeah, I think we are starting make sure I have the right internet connection up. Sorry. That should be better. Okay. So, can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you for the thumbs up, Carl. So today we're going to be talking about the end of the Meiji period and making a transition towards the Taisho period. And I'm going to sort of continue our talk from last class. We talked a bit about how things were a little bit volatile, right? People in Japan were getting upset about lots of things, and there were some different movements from socialism and anarchism that were trying to call for more extreme forms of liberty for the individual. And we talked about some of the ways that this also resulted to more labor unionization and those kinds of things. So we're going to keep, this train keeps going, right? And in the Meiji period, it keeps going into the Taisho period. And I want to take a look at a few things in particular. Do you have any questions or any, before we get started? Anybody have anything they want to ask? I just wanted to call your attention to, I put up a little quick lecture, like a video about essay writing that's up on Moodle. as well as some sample high grade essays from my past several years teaching this class. So for essay 1. So if you would like to think about your essay 2 and how you can improve on it, you can use my comments, which are available in your Word document. Essays that are graded or those from Devin. But you can also use these my comments that I made in the lecture, as well as you can look at these sample essays. My ask when essay 2 is due on the syllabus is the day that right now is what the current due date is. I don't have the syllabus up right now. But yeah, just check the syllabus on Moodle for the due date. If I change the syllabus, which I may choose to do to take off some things, I will email everybody, and you will have the latest, most up-to-date syllabus on Moodle every time. Every time. So, let's see on the chat. Other questions? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and do a screen share with you guys. I'm going to ask you some questions along the way. So if you could just turn your microphones on when I do that, that would be really good. Okay. Okay. So we talked last class about Japan's victory over Russia, how this was an enormous deal for Japan. They were so much pride, and although the victory was celebrated in Japan, the terms of the end of their fighting, the end of the Japanese war, did not give Japan all that it wanted, and we talked a bit about that. One of the big things was that Russia refused to pay to pay any indemnity, right? So the sort of cash prize that comes from winning a war in the modern period for all kinds of countries does not accrue to Japan, and this creates a lot of frustration. There was a lot of excitement in Japan about their sacrifice that they had made, kind of making good on the imperial rescript that told them to, if emergency arises, offer themselves courageously to the state. They did that. The soldiers' mothers, and their fathers as well, I suppose. But and the whole country worked together to make the war effort a success. And so when this didn't happen, there was a lot of frustration. And the biggest frustration sort of meltdown occurs in 1905, just after the announcement of the terms of the Treaty of Portsmouth. This is the Hibiya riot in 1905. So this is in September. This is a riot in which people in Japan, beginning first of all in Tokyo, and then becoming a national movement, protest against the government's inability to stake Japan's importance and its claim in the global arena, and to demand that the government sort of give back to the people of Japan what they have worked for, what they have earned. And sort of it's an accountability movement, really. This is a picture of the riot here. And I want to sort of take a second to talk about this riot. I think it's a turning point for the history of modern Japan. It is, some would say, the beginning of popular protest over 13 years of frequent protests in Japan. And it is the birth of the sort of mass movements in Japan. So I want to sort of dwell on this for a little bit. So Hibiya Park is a park that was built as a parade ground right next to the Imperial Palace, right? The Emperor's windows actually look down upon this space. It's a very important public gathering space, very modern space that was built to try and, sort of give the nation a place to gather and be seen. So having the riot there was no accident. And so when the first demonstrators arrived, right away, the police don't want to have this special, very visible space be, filled with people who are protesting or who are rioting. And so the police were quite violent right away. But the protesters there, they grew to tens of thousands, right, in this particular square and then all over Tokyo. And over the next several days, this spread to almost all of Japan's prefectures. The government had to actually declare martial law. And what we see is that the people are taking the frustration out on the government, and they're attacking all kinds of symbols of government, right? Police stations or police boxes in Japan, they're smaller police stations. They're attacking government offices at the level of the prefecture. They're just trying to sort of do damage to symbols of the government. And really it was that the people of Japan thought, we have given our lives and we have bled on the battlefield for this nation, which you have told us is our responsibility, but we're not allowed to vote. We're not allowed to really give any significant input into how the country is run. And the proof of that is that this government that we have supposedly elected, but not really elected, has failed to even get us a Russian indemnity. And so from this point on, there is a new sort of fear among elite government officials of the masses, and a heightened awareness of the masses that they do have a voice. And so we have this is sort of a turning point for modern Japan. I'm going to show you a picture here that I want us to talk about briefly. So you can just turn your cameras on, that would be good, and your microphones. So this is this is the Imperial Palace here, the sort of center of Tokyo, the former Shogun's palace. And this is Shibuya Park here, the parade ground where the military has the exercises and where other important national events happen. So you can see it's really just right. But anyway, this is actually not in Shibuya Park. This is actually the moat. If I go back a slide, this is the Imperial Moat. It's actually up here in this part of the moat up here. But it's a very important, part of the symbolic and sort of beautiful spaces in the capital is this separate space. And, it's a special place. And people here, can you see what they're doing in this picture? I'm going to try and see if I can see some people's faces on Zoom while I'm looking at it. So what's happening in this picture?
They cleaning something? Picking up something?
This guy here, maybe he's something on the ground, but they're not cleaning something, but that could be a good guess. If I can see speaker view. What's going on here? Any guesses?
Are they forming some sort of like picket line?
No, that's a good guess, but no. I see Sam's hand up. Yeah.
Are they fishing, maybe?
Fishing.
Seems
yeah,
like
there's a guy that's fishing there, right? Yeah. And they're all fishing, right? There are women in kimono who are fishing. There's a man here fishing. So like, what does that say about how they're feeling about the government that they're fishing in the imperial moat? What do you think?
It seems very disrespectful.
Oh yeah, this is a huge sign of disrespect, right? So this is just one of the kinds of things that are happening. There's actually there are actually some really great pictures we can't go into today, but there are great pictures of all kinds of things where people are clearly just giving the government kind of the finger, right, during this uprising. And so here, the fishing in the moat, these are actually sacred fish. You're not allowed to fish in the imperial moat. You're not allowed to even approach the imperial moat. And so this is the kind of sort of attitude that has overcome Japan around 1905 after the war was over. People were just exhausted and they were angry at their government. And they would stay so in many cases for the next several years. Okay, thanks for that. You can go back to what you need to go back to. So if we sort of fast forward a little bit in time, we come to the end of the Meiji period, which does end a lot of things for Japan. Although there's a continuity between the Meiji and the post-Meiji anti-government emotions and sort of rebellions. But anyway, the Meiji period comes to an end in 1912 with the death of the Meiji emperor. I mean, if you were alive in 1912 in Japan, you had come to know who this person was, why he was so important. He had gone from being someone that people weren't sure if they were supposed to, respect and bow to, or if they were supposed to run away and be afraid because he might strike them down. He'd become a well-known figure through a very sort of purposeful campaign of vulgarization, of publicity. And so his death was really a very big deal. In the papers, they talked about all of his illnesses as they progressed, so that people could read about his health every day. And so, this was a national moment of mourning. And even those people who didn't like the imperial state, who were opposed to the imperial state, they were very sad to see the emperor die. And they wrote, elegies and eulogies and poems and things about his death. He really is the person who sort of symbolized Japan's jump into the modern Western sphere, and Japan's transformation really was centered on this one figure, both his actual person, but also his sort of figurative persona. So his death was a big shock for the country of Japan. And as we can see here, a lot of people wearing Shinto robes, because he had by now become the high priest of Shinto. Even though, in fact, up until the Meiji period, Shinto priests would never approach a funeral because it's a defiling, polluting activity, right? So anyway, this is a very new modern thing as well. But anyway, so it's a really interesting moment. Another picture we can see here of the funeral cortege, and again, lots of Shinto imagery and paraphernalia, and the country as a whole was watching this happen. The sort of amplitude of this event was magnified even more by how people responded to it and how those responses were publicly visible. General Nogi Marusuke, who was a very successful general for the Japanese, the Imperial Army, I should say, who had fought very valiantly in the Sino-Japanese War and other areas as well, felt very strongly that the emperor's death was a time for him to reclaim the traditional values of, or in his view, of the samurai class of Japan, and to actually commit ritual suicide. So he actually commits seppuku along with his wife to follow his lord into death. And this of course leads to a really big debate, but no one asked the important question, which was, well, how many samurai actually committed suicide back in the Edo period? And there actually were not that many. But anyway, at this point in time, they're asking questions of what this means for Japan, right? How modern has Japan become if people are still committing seppuku? And what kind of country are we going to be if we are still trying to wrestle with this traditionalism that's holding on? He's still a very popular figure in terms of to talk about in Japan today. There's an area in Tokyo called Nogizaka, or Nogi's Hill, where there's a shrine that he is venerated at. And there are some pretty interesting, sometimes gory items that you can peruse that feeds this sort of continued fascination with this traditionalist general. So anyway, the Meiji period's conclusion is the beginning of the Taisho period, in which the new emperor, the son of the Meiji emperor, becomes the Taisho emperor. It lasts for much less time than the Meiji period. It's also an important time in the history of Japan. It sort of matures as a modern nation during this next period. So you can see 1912, 1926 is the time period of the Taisho period. In this time period, I'm going to highlight a few people here that are on this long list of prime ministers. We can see many of these people have, they're repeat offenders. They're there more than once. The people that are most important for today's lecture are Saionji Kimochi and Katsura Taro, who are going to alternate as prime minister during this sort of tumultuous era when power was going sort of from the Meiji emperor, and his death was being given to his son. So the sort of there are several uprisings and small issues that happen. I mentioned the Ashio copper mine pollution incident and those riots happening in 1907, 1908. That happened, those happened after the Hibiya riots, but there's still more to come. And so with the dawn of the Taisho era, there was a hope that Japan would sort of continue to become more and more democratic, right? And the first few months of the Taisho era, after the Emperor Meiji's death, show that this is not going to be the case. And it's hard to sort of condense, but I'm going to try and do so briefly. So the emperor's death is followed by a Taisho political crisis. The prime minister decides to make some military spending cuts because he would like, to balance the budget. And he also believes the military has gotten too powerful. He's actually a protege of Ito Hirobumi, who was in fact a constitutionalist and someone who was in favor of government, but not in favor of sort of authoritarian government. In response to these cuts, the army ministers, so someone in the cabinet, resigned in protest and frustration. And then the army refused to vet and approve a new minister to replace this army minister who had resigned on the cabinet. So after trying to find a solution, Saionji Kimochi himself resigns and a new prime minister is named. The emperor appoints the prime minister in Japan. I guess that's the same as in Great Britain. On the advice in this case of the Privy Council, he appoints Katsura Taro, who most people thought would be a good choice for this. He himself was a steady hand, a former prime minister himself, but also a former general of the Imperial Army. So I thought he could step in and figure this out. But he was unwilling to completely sort of approve all military expenditures. And at this point in time, by the way, the military has been sort of building slowly over time to look after Japanese interests on the continent, in Korea and in Manchuria, Northeast China, I should say, as well as in Japan's foreign legations in Tianjin and in the Shandong part of China, continues to get larger and larger, and they continue to want more and more money, right? So anyway, he doesn't approve the next budgetary demand of the Navy that comes through when he's prime minister. And in this, the Navy withholds a minister there, so they refuse to vet and approve a new minister, and he therefore also has an incomplete cabinet. Now, what he does next is what causes the largest problem, is that he asks the emperor, who is the head, right, by the constitution, right, of his military, to order the Navy to provide a minister. So the prime minister wants to bypass sort of the electoral or the democratic elements of his government by asking the emperor to force one of the government institutions, in this case the Navy, to provide a minister of the Navy. This leads right away to cries of foul play, right, of anti-democratic activity. The Taisho riot in 1913 is a response to this effort. A coalition of journalists, as well as members of the Diet, and a variety of different figures in business, form a movement to protect the constitutional government, and they incite a riot, right? Not your average rioter, but these people who have some stature in society, who are going to the streets and are protesting the effort of Katsura Taro to bypass the constitutional protocols, and it becomes a much larger movement. It goes through, Japan's major cities have this sort of riot happening around government offices. And so this continues to sort of fuel the fire of anti-government sentiment in these large cities. It's nowhere near as large as the Hibiya riots or riots that will come later, but it does sort of keep the fire burning, so to speak. And there were some arrests as well. So Katsuda continues to make some mistakes. He suspends the diet 3 times because they are making his job difficult, which continues to show sort of anti-democratic tendencies, and then he eventually has to resign. And the next prime minister, Yamamoto Gonohyoe, who is appointed, is also a military figure, in his case from the Navy, and he will sort of try and see Japan through this and will calm things down. He'll also make some deals to approve some military budgets. But the people of Japan sort of are looking very warily at the government at this point, and worried about their democracy's shape and where it's going. The last important riot I want to talk about are the rice riots. These are like one of my favorite riots to talk about and to read about. So in 1918, Japan was doing pretty well in lots of ways. As we may talk about if we have time today, the world was very busy at war in 1918 and had been since 1914. So Japanese silk, which was very important before the war, becomes the only silk available, as Italian silk is unavailable during the war. And other things like cotton and other textiles also become even more important than before the war. So Japan's business interests and their economic growth are quite impressive during this time period. But at the same time, there are also issues that are playing in the background that make for a sort of a volatile situation as well. So the big event that sets off this riot is rice prices. Japanese farmers are selling rice to the government for very cheap prices, but the price of rice is very high on the market. And as farmers become aware of this, they're more and more frustrated that they're not getting they're not reaping the benefits of of these high prices that are being paid for their rice, even though they themselves are being paid the government for it very little. So this is a big issue, and rice prices are skyrocketing, and rice brokers are making a killing, and so it's not a good time economically. But the other issue is that in 1918, Japan was taking part very loosely in World War I, but they get more involved at the very end of World War I, and they go on what's called a Siberian intervention. So they go to Siberia to try and help the White Russians, who are trying to, hopefully have a counter-revolution that will allow that will suppress the rising communist elements, the Bolshevik elements in Russia. So these soldiers, that's the long story I can't go into today, but they kind of stay for a long time, but they also are needing materials, they're also needing food. So a lot of rice is being redirected from Japan and Japan's colonies at this point, being Taiwan and Korea in particular, to these soldiers. And so the soldiers have the rice and the peasants and the farmers don't. And some fisherwomen actually in Toyama, which you see here right on my little map here, they actually see rice being taken away, right? Like big truckloads of rice being carried away from a rice producing area where they are. And they're fed up, and they start to petition the government of their prefecture to give them some of the rice at a reasonable price, and then it becomes an actual riot. And this is a big riot that I'm not sure what I have on the slide here, but it becomes a national riot, and it really is one that affects all of Japan, and it's sort of it's not political, right? It's economic, and this is the area in which the government had assumed that they would be okay, right? And so they are again afraid of the masses. As we'll discuss next class, this is a time period when a new kind of politician is sort of comes to the fore. We'll talk about a figure named Harake or Hara Takeshi, who steps in and becomes prime minister and ends the rice riots. But he's also the first prime minister who is not from the army or the military or the Satsuma Choshu cliques of that preceded those posts. So he is really a politician who rose to the ranks as a politician and becomes prime minister, and he's able, through lots of compromising and wheeling and dealing, to sort of get people to calm down and come to the table and work together. So anyway, what I want to do now, I just want to see how we're doing for time. We're good. Okay. Is talk about what's happening economically, sort of in the background of the rights riots, but also overall. So I mentioned during the First World War that we see Japan's production and exports increase dramatically, and we also see that prices of goods in Japan go up, which is good for business, but not necessarily good for consumers. But in that moment, there is the rise of someone that the book talks about as a narikin, or someone who has become rich, who wasn't born but who became rich, or who was a part of the nouveau riche. And these people are very visible, and they're a new kind of wealth that is very modern and new for Japan. The image that you see here, I think it's in the book, but basically what we're saying is what he's doing is he's well, I mean, can anybody see what he's doing? Maybe I can ask you.
Looks like he's burning a paper.
He's burning paper, yeah. What kind of paper is it? Can
Document
you
of
want to
some
tell?
sort.
Money?
Money, yeah. This is the money. This is a banknote of 100 yen, right? 100 yen note he's burning here. So he needed some light, so he's burning money, and that's how rich these people were. And they were lampooned in cartoons and all that kind of stuff because they were so wealthy and so free with their wealth. But they do speak to the economic prowess of that class in this moment. You may have heard this term before, Zaibatsu, and I mentioned it very briefly a few classes ago, but this is the time period after 1912, 13, when these cliques really become sort of so powerful and important. Some come from before the war, and some come from later. Can anyone identify the symbol on the top right of my screen with the red diamonds?
Mitsubishi.
Mitsubishi, yeah, that's one of the Zaibatsu. How about the one on the bottom? You know what that is? The one on the bottom is Mitsui. So Mitsui is a house that goes back, as we may have discussed a little bit, to the Edo period. They were a merchant family. They were one of the top couple of merchant families who were bankers for the shogunate. And then as the government goes through these changes and becomes the Meiji government and is very different, this new Meiji government then also still has Mitsui as their primary private bankers. And Mitsui becomes one of these Zaibatsu. So what is a Zaibatsu? This is a term that we should know about for future reference. These are usually companies that involve a merchant company or a bank, some old like Mitsui, some new like Mitsubishi, but they are going to combine, right, the banking and the banking center of the government of the company with transport and trade and mining and manufacturing branches, and they all work together. And because they are so well coordinated, they grow substantially, and then they're able to do incredible things that U.S. antitrust legislation made very difficult to do, although sometimes it was done, but perhaps a sort of less overt way. And because of that, the government relies upon them to do things like build bridges and railroads, and they rely upon them also sometimes for loans, and so it becomes very closely attached. And as Japan's foothold on the continent expands, it is these Zaibatsu that are the ones that are building factories and railroads and other industries that that require protection and that will want to stay in these places. And by the 1920s, you know, they're about a fifth of Japan's economy is definitely occupied by these 10 or so financial clicks or zaibatsu. So that's a picture that looks pretty good, right? But at the same time, there is an underside to what's happening. There is a lot of speculation, a lot of people who are aspiring to become wealthy are trying to do so, and there's a lot of a lot of risk happening, being taken. In between the rice issue in 1918, there's a small market fair in 1919. There's a major market crash in 1920 that takes place because of risky loans that were given out, mostly to people, mostly to farmers actually, who defaulted on these risky loans because there was no way they could pay them back. And this leads to sort of a shaky period in 1920-21. But the country kind of bounces back, right? The government puts in place some measures to try and stabilize the economy, and is successful until 1923. 1923 is a pivotal moment for the history of Japan. It is in September 1923, an earthquake takes place in the Kanto region, but especially centering on Tokyo and Yokohama, that dramatically affects the country as a whole. It was 7.9 on the Richter scale. It's an enormous earthquake that began at lunchtime, and people were, usually they were cooking at lunchtime, and the cooking fires, when the earthquake occurred, they fell over and they led to fires. So the biggest issue, besides there were some major sort of cracks in the earth, was the fire that broke out. The death toll has been kept at 150,000, although we probably have a few more thousand who died from related events over the next several months. Tokyo lost three-quarters of its homes. They were destroyed, and Yokohama lost, I would say, a similar number of homes as well. And so we have a homeless population in the Kanto region of over 2 million people overnight with nowhere to stay. People are actually trying to find locations to stay, and they actually end up going to places. For example, the area they go to, Japan's new public parks like Hibiya Park, or they go to Ueno Park, and they try and build sort of shanty town tent houses there to survive. But people aren't the only ones who are suffering. We also have the suffering of industry and financial groups in Japan. Bank headquarters mostly are in Tokyo, and 121 of those headquarters are destroyed by this earthquake out of 138. So it's a pretty substantial part of Japan's economy. Took a huge blow. You can imagine all the documents, all of the paperwork required before we had computers or anything like that, to have been compromised by the earthquake and the fires and things that came out of that. It was just a really substantial moment. And factories also across the country region were destroyed by the earthquake as well, making it an even bigger dent in Japan's industrial landscape. This is a picture of Nihonbashi. I think this is Nihonbashi, the bridge in the busiest part of eastern Tokyo. And this is the bridge again. But as you see here, this whole area here has been devastated, right, by the earthquake. Talk about this as a leveling earthquake, right? That just leveled parts of the city. Another view here of earthquake damage in eastern Tokyo. Another image here. This is actually a bit further south. East Tokyo destroyed parts of Tokyo. And here we see it's actually part of the Ginza here. We see people, firemen running here to put out the fires that have taken over the city. So what I have here is a map of the damaged, the fire damaged areas of Tokyo, and so in red is that. So here we have the Imperial Palace here in the middle of Tokyo, and then here we have. I mean, this is Nihonbashi here, and I talked about that a little bit. The part the one we saw next with where it was all flattened was here in Kyobashi. So these are the areas most affected all the way over here to Honjo and Fukugawa ward. So this is kind of the area that was the most damaged by this. And Hibiya Park, as you can see here, was mostly saved, and then this people sort of flocked to that area. Hibiya Park, which is down here, also mostly spared because it was so open, nothing to burn really. In this case, people went there as well. So what does this map tell us about how natural disasters or catastrophes of this nature affect the people of Tokyo? I'm trying to see if I can see some people's hands or faces here on Zoom. What does this map tell us about the fires that ravaged Tokyo in the aftermath of the Great Kanto earthquake?
It was really focused around the river.
Okay, that's a really good point, Alexandra. Let's build on that. So who lives near the river? This is Japan's major river, the Sumida River, but who lives near the river? Any ideas?
Traders and fishermen.
Fishermen, traders, says Ferris. Okay, good. So like, if you does this term from before ring a bell? The shitamachi at all, or what that term means? Does that ring a bell at all? From before exam one?
It's the lower city.
The lower city, right? So lower city is at the level of the river. So this is why what you said, Ferris, and what you said, Alexandra, is correct. This is the low city, right? It's at the level of the river, and that's where this fire is mostly concentrated. People who live there are fishermen and workers. This area here, for example, Honjoku. Can you guys see my cursor when I do that or not? I'm not sure. You can see it. So
I can see your
Honjoku.
cursor.
Great, thank you. Here is actually the ward with all the factories. Most of the factories in Tokyo are there. It's the industrial sort of smokestack ward. Fukugawa-ku is a mixed place, but this area here is where, if you'll recall our talks before, the houses are closer together. So why would this area be sort of more prone to fire than the Yanote, the high city on this side over here?
Well,
Yeah,
I mean,
Sam.
It's just more congested. It's just very built up, I would assume. Just very tightly put together.
Okay, so it's congested, tight together. What else might contribute to the burnability? I see Michael Golden's hand. So let me ask.
It's like all the textiles and stuff, a lot of flammable materials.
Okay, so a lot of flammable things are there, right? So textile factories, a lot of places that are running on steam have a lot of fire anyway that can break out. Definitely. I saw. Let's see. Kelly's hand. Kelly Lynch, are you?
Oh, my name's Carrie.
Oh, sorry, Carrie. I lost your name. I can't find it anymore, but I saw, yeah. So Carrie, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say that similar to what people were just saying, that there's a lot more wood and probably and it's less dense, or it's more dense, and
Yeah,
so
right. So huge, right? The
um,
wood is a big factor, right? So people who don't have a lot of means are building houses that are smaller and closer together, and they're also made out of wood, right? Um, and in the higher city, the houses are bigger. They're made out of, brick or cement or stone. There's some wood probably, but the main building materials are not actually wood. And the houses have more space, and so the fire doesn't get very far. The fire is mostly contained within the busiest part of the high city, which is here in Kojimachi ward here. So this map, I think, sort of, it highlights the kind of inequality, right, that persisted in this modern industrialized Japan. And the map really is the same in many ways as the map of Japan was in the Edo period of Tokyo. Edo was back in the shogunate controlled city of Edo, right? And so we have this continuity of space and people on this area, and they suffered the most. So are we out of time yet? It's hard to see the time. Yeah. So what I want to do next is sort of keep going with this. So the city as a whole suffered, but the people who suffered the most, who died the most, who were the most homeless, came from the low city or the shitamachi, and they suffered. Their suffering sort of is again and again sort of front and center, right? And so, the Japan's promises of a better, modern, industrialized future for everyone, if everyone, sort of serves the interests of the state, they're again and again shown to be only partially true, right? And this is one of those examples. In the aftermath of the Great Krakatoa earthquake, people also needed a lot of help, and they again took a lot of risky loans that banks shouldn't have been making. This is a pattern that we see, throughout the Western world as well, in the 1920s, and this is will eventually come back to haunt Japan, but just so we know that that's happening. So I want to briefly talk about now, as we finish class today, is the people of Japan, right? People who live in eastern or southeastern Shitamachi or low city Tokyo are the ones suffering the most in that context. But throughout Japan, the lower classes as a whole are not doing well, as you can imagine, right? In a rapidly industrializing country that Japan is. So in the rural areas, there is a small landlord class, and there was a small owner, farmer class. But most people in Japan are part of the tenant farmer class, or the sort of sharecropper class, and they're the ones who don't own the land they work on, and who are not able to keep most of what they actually grow, I should say. And 1920s is a time when we begin to sort of really have a lot of attention focused on this class of people. Nagatsuka, it's actually missing a U there, but Takahashi publishes this serial in Japan's leading paper, the Asahi Shimbun, called The Soil, in which he just talks about how hard it is for people to live and work. He talks about how their hands are cracked and bleeding, and then talks about how they don't eat every day, and just he sort of tries to sort of expose the reality of the rural farming class, and people across the big cities they take notice of this, and they're interested in this quite a bit. He also points to the fact that this contradicts the sort of promise that the Meiji government initially had made to sort of to open up the class system so that people could be all equal, and could also move between professions, and there wouldn't be hierarchy, but there really was hierarchy. And so partially thanks to his work, but also to others as well, the first union of Japanese farmers was founded in 1922. And they do push for sort of a more for the government to sort of take notice of their problems and to help them, right? And they mobilize, throughout the pre-war period to try and get to negotiate aid, to have access to better equipment, and to also keep their land when it's under the threat of being, bought by force by corporations or by the government. Another group that has gained some self-awareness in the 1910s is the Borakumin. This is a group of people who actually date back to even before the Edo period. They were people who performed jobs that were considered polluted jobs, so jobs like tanning of leather or handling the bodies of the dead, things that would be ritually impure, touching blood, those kinds of things. They were liberated as a class, by a government in 1876, but the reality of liberation did not look like this promise that they were given. The Barakumin have really quite an interesting and amazing story, but they were necessary, right, for cities. They were the ones, for example, sometimes who would come and collect urine or feces to fertilize fields. They were the ones who actually would carry the stuff, even that wasn't actually ritually impure. They would do that kind of work. They were taking care of the dead, and they were doing all these important, and they were tanning and were making leather for people who needed it for all kinds of things. Disposing of carcasses of animals that were used to make food. So these people were a well-known entity throughout Japan, and so they had an identity, and when they got last names, their last names were sort of a common few last names. So it was hard sometimes, people knew where you were from, to deny that you were from the Barakumin class. Or if you had a name that belonged to that class, it was hard to know that you belonged to that class. So they were really discriminated against when they tried to move into other kinds of employment, other kinds of classes. It actually continues on up and actually into the 1990s and 2000s, but they do begin in 1800 to organize themselves to try and help one another out in a mutual aid society. And then they created the Suheisha in 22, which is their effort to demand equal rights to everyone else in Japan, and fight for the rights of those who continue to practice the Barakumin lifestyle and employment to do so sort of safely. I think I'm going to stop for today, and I will touch upon these urban classes more next class, and we can talk about them in more detail. But I think that this has sort of been a good overview for us to go all the way through the Taisho period up until the earthquake, and through the classes that were suffering in the rural areas. So thank you for your attention, everybody, and for taking part in answering my questions. And thank you, Carrie, for telling me that your name is not Kelly. And I look forward to seeing all of you on Thursday. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
Professor, I had a question.
Stop the share and just 1 second. Let me just
no problem.
turn off the stop recording. Okay.